Are you one of the chosen? Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me. Today I have a review for you of The Unworthy by Agustina Bazterrica and translated by Sarah Moses. This is being published by Scribner in early March of 2025, and I was given a complimentary copy in exchange for an honest review. Agustina Bazterrica blew up in the scene with Tender is the Flesh, and this is an incredible follow-up. I think it is really, really wonderful, but it is not at all like Tender is the Flesh, and so you have to know that going in. I think before Tender is the Flesh, she had also written a collection of short stories called 19 Claws and a Blackbird. And those were very weird stories, and they also weren't like Tender is the Flesh. So people went into reading them having found Tender is the Flesh and expecting something like that. And what they show is that she contains multitudes. Her stories are dark. They have this dark weirdness to them, this like sense of presence, but they aren't all the same as Tender is the Flesh. And that's the same with The Unworthy. So The Unworthy is much more cerebral, and it doesn't have as strong of a narrative through line as Tender is the Flesh does. This is an epistolary story, but it is a story written on contraband paper that is hidden in floorboards. It is written with quills and with other sharp objects, with whatever ink that can be made from grounding up bugs and mixing it with blood. It is not a easy or convenient story. It takes place in some unknown time in the future after there's been some climate apocalypse where everyone has gone mad and everything has become difficult to live with. It takes place in this kind of cloistered convent of this radical faith. We don't really know what they believe. We know they don't believe in the Christian God, even though this clearly used to be a Christian monastery. They call that the false God. But what they do believe is not clear, except we know that they believe in violence, in punishment, in earning your salvation. And that all makes sense in this apocalyptic environment where you have to fight off the world. You have to keep the world at bay. So it is through pain and through suffering and through sacrifice that you can find some sort of salvation, even if that salvation is never really defined, right? We don't really know what these women, because it is a convent, except for the one man who's always hidden behind a screen at their services, except for him. We don't know what these women want, like what their hope is other than surviving. As I said, it is an epistolary story. It's written in this first person narrative from the point of view of this one character. We never learn her name, and I think it's really powerful that way. Many epistolary stories, they feel like they are using that style as a crutch and that it isn't necessary, and they're really trying to tell a big narrative and they're just using that as a stylistic choice. I don't think that's the case here. I think here the style is really important because we have one person's perspective on the end of the world and what it means to survive the end of the world. And is what she is doing surviving? That's a question. And the narrative never gets out of her control, right? It's never this big epic narrative where you're like, well, how would she really believe that? Which is what happens sometimes when you have epistolary novels, that they have to include events that seem like they wouldn't be part of our main character's experience. But here it's very contained, it's very isolated, and it works really, really well because it gives you this intimate portrait of this woman. Now, through her narrative, you learn a little bit about her backstory before she came to this, violent convent, if you want to call it that. You learn about that in bits and pieces. You learn about what she had to do to survive, her memories of her mother, her memories of the found family she had along the way, her memory of what was taken from her, what she lost, what she had to sacrifice, and what was stolen. And that makes her character so much more compelling, but it's given to you in little bits and pieces. So you have to earn it, right? You don't get it all right in the beginning. So her character is an enigma. She has survived by dissimulation. She has survived by pretending, by not showing what she really feels. So even as a reader, we're kept at a distance from her. And I think that is really appropriate because it pulls you into her. It makes you want to know more about her. It never feels cheap or like a gimmick. And she feels like a really genuine and robust character, but she just isn't revealed all at once. The story is about understanding her and about learning how she understands herself in this bigger world. This is a piece of both religious and apocalyptic horror that isn't straightforward. What it is twisty, and it is carving itself into your psyche. It is infesting your mind and your ideas. So it isn't something that gives you satisfying answers right away, but instead it infects you and it makes you think over and over again. And it like lives with you much longer than the book itself does. Once you close the book, it's still there. It is still sunk into your bones. It is written in the scars that has left all over your body. So I think it is really, really exciting in that way and compelling. It gets under your skin. It isn't straightforward. It is a relatively short story, or novel rather, but it cuts to the bone. Like I said, it isn't narrative based, it's character based. And because of that, it can really dig its claws in quite deep with this intense atmosphere and this sense of brutality that is ever present. Both brutality on what is outside of the wall, where they escaped from. And even in this convent, their salvation itself is a brutal type of salvation. It isn't easy. The nuns, I don't know, they don't call themselves nuns, I suppose. They call themselves sisters, but they are all hoping to be chosen, to become one of the chosen or to become one of the enlightened. The chosen, they seem to have some sort of mystical powers, but those mystical powers are nurtured by their mutilation. So there are 3 different types of chosen, and some of them have their eyes sewn shut, and some of them have their tongues cut out, and some of them have their ears removed. So the chosen have to be mutilated in order to access whatever sacred nature they have. And the enlightened are the ones that are not mutilated, yet through their lack of mutilation, they're able to even become above a minor saint. What are these women striving for, and what is sacred to them, and what is mystical to them, is all up in the air. And it's a brutal kind of mysticism that is appropriate for this apocalyptic setting that they're trying to survive. Now, what is really telling is our main character, like I said, she's an enigma. She doesn't want to share much of herself, but this is a journal. And one of the ways you learn most about her is she crosses out lines in her journal. So as you're reading, there are sections that are crossed out. And those are the sections that she feels afraid to even have written down. Like, she's written them down, but then she's crossed them out because she doesn't want to admit them to herself. Those are parts of her own journey that she doesn't want to look at yet. So through seeing what she is too afraid to say, we learn more about her, which is just a really clever way to create depth to a character and show that a character is fighting herself as she is fighting the world as well. We meet all of the other characters from the perspective of our main character, since this is a first-person epistolary story. So our experiences of them are limited, right? We only understand them from the outside and only through as our main character understands them. But they still are varied, they're still interesting, and I think as a whole, the different characters that populate the story keep the story dynamic and exciting. They are natural foes and they are natural allies, and so we're able to create a community within this story, even though we don't have much depth on any of the other characters except for our main character. And even our main character, the depth we get with her is a depth that we have to fight for. We have to fight for every inch that she gives us. Because what the story brings is this deep disquiet, this sense of atmosphere, this unsettled reality that you don't know what is going to happen. When your sacred rites are bought with mutilation, what is salvation? And because these ideas are being explored, and it's being written as a journal entry, there is this poetic nature to a lot of the language. It is poetic, it's almost elegiac, it is very speculative, it is wondering about the nature of reality, as well as the nature of violence, as well as the nature of love and community, and it works really well. I think that the writing, not being straightforward, but instead of being almost dreamlike, being very internalized writing, being very emotional writing, works for this story. Especially since the story is short. I think if the story was like 100 pages longer, that might be overwhelming. It might be too much. But the story is just the right size that it can indulge this kind of writing, this kind of style, this prose that is very dreamlike, very focused on the self, but not knowing who the self is at the same time. So it has this poetic feeling to it, this like always constant not knowing. It can have that and not feel overindulgent and not, become too much. So it is quite stylized writing in that way, but it works really well for the story, and it really does go a long way to helping you understand the character. And the whole point of the story is the character. There isn't a lot of narrative in this story. Now, narrative does pick up, especially in the back half, because a new character from the outside is introduced who kind of is like a stone being thrown into a calm lake. There are ripples of her introduction, and so we have to contend with that. So there is more narrative that happens when this new character is introduced to the story. But the first half, there isn't a lot of narrative. It's just trying to survive day by day. So the style is really important, and the atmosphere and the understanding of place is really important, because this is much more cerebral of a story than a narrative-driven story. You never feel safe reading this story because you are so, intricately connected with the main character, and she never feels safe. But the story is exploring ideas of safety. It is exploring ideas of misogyny and patriarchy, and what does it mean to live absent them, or can you ever be free of them once they have taken over the world? There are ideas about victimhood and about abuse, and what does it mean to become an abuser? If that is in the name of your survival, is it the same thing? What part of yourself is lost when you are the one inflicting harm on others, both emotional harm and physical harm? And if becoming that type of abuser is necessary in order to survive, is that surviving worth it? There are questions about power and faith. How can power and faith be so majestic and salvific, yet at the same time, how can they be crippling and dehumanizing? All these ideas are explored, but the important thing about this story is that it is not trying to find answers to these questions. All of these ideas, from climate apocalypse to misogyny to everything in between, These are just background for our main character. These are what the character experiences, what she feels, and how she understands herself. So these questions about power, about violence, about religiosity, about faith, about self-determination, these are all just the substrate upon which she is trying to understand herself as a person. Because the big question is, what does it mean to live in a broken world? How can you be a responsible caretaker of humanity in a broken world? What responsibilities do we have when you are faced with nothing but pain and suffering and violence? Do we have responsibilities to others, or do we only have to care for ourselves? And what I really liked about the story is it isn't holding your hand, it is confronting you with these ideas. And it is confronting you because our main character is confronted with them. They are how she understands her life. But it is not trying to give you an easy answer. It is not trying to give you a padded landing. It is just throwing these difficulties in your face and saying, these are the reality, now figure it out, which is really exciting. The story isn't content with giving you easy answers to anything. The story doesn't resolve with answering anything. What it resolves with is uncertainty. It resolves with an atmosphere that is still pervaded by danger and discomfort. Danger and discomfort and not knowing are the core facets of the world. And it doesn't try to solve them. It just tries to say we have to live with them. The story doesn't have a neat and easy resolution. It's more like having a painful boil that is lanced and drained, and that you know that you've gotten rid of the infection, but you still have an open wound as a result. And there's no guarantee that it won't become infected again. Like, that is what the story is doing. It is making bare all of the injustices and saying, you can't escape these. You have to learn what it means to live with them and find out the difference between living with them and surviving through them. And can you make a difference when your hands are tied behind your back and you don't have many options? So if you can't tell, I really, really enjoyed the story. I thought it was incredibly cerebral. I thought it was really, really engaging. I thought it was exploring some really heavy themes, heavy ideas, but it wasn't beating you over the head with them. And like I said, it's a short story. You can read it in a day or two, but when you close the book, it doesn't go away. It sits with you. And I really appreciate that. So this is another big recommendation for me. Again, with the caveat, it is not like Tender is the Flesh. It does have the same heaviness in tone or in ideas, but the way the story is written is much different. It doesn't have a focus on plot or on narrative the same way Tender is the Flesh did. So if you really are expecting a repeat of that, then you might be disappointed. But if you go into this without that expectation, realizing that it isn't focused on plot, but instead is focused on character and on atmosphere, and what does it mean to live or survive in a world that doesn't want you to survive, then I think you'll get a lot more out of this. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Has anyone had a chance to read this yet? Have you read 19 Claws and Blackbird in addition to Tender is the Flesh? And also, I'd love to hear your thoughts about epistolary stories. I am hot and cold on them. I think when they're done well, they create a real level of intimacy that I really appreciate and I enjoy. But when they aren't done well, they feel tacky and they feel like a crutch. So I go hot and cold. I think this one uses the epistolary format really, really well, and it gives you a real interesting vantage point into the story. If you know of any other epistolary horror stories that use that format really well, I'd love to hear your suggestions about those down in the comments as well. Okay, I think that's all I have for today. So thank you so much for spending some time with me. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.